Welcome to Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and my great partner, Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Oh, hello, Tom. It's so lovely to see you. You've been all around the world since we last spoke.
I have almost, not literally, but I've been around a bit. Yeah, it's true. And lots of trips coming up. So I'm fortunate to be able to do that. And also around the country in England as well. So I've been sort of Newcastle to Bodmin and all around. So yeah, I see a lot of places. How about you? Where have you been?
Not as far flung as you. I've not been I've not been past the country boundaries, but I've been down to London. I've been up to Liverpool. I've been across to the Fens. I've been all over the place. So, and obviously East Midlands as well, round and about. So quite a good view of what's going on in primary nationally, but I haven't gone international like you have. And I can't wait to hear about your travels and your learnings from those travels.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things we're going to do in this episode. So for people listening in, Emma and I, every so often, if you look at our back catalogue, occasionally just don't have a guest, and this is one of those episodes, and we just sort of share each other's experience of the education system as we engage with it. And this time we have stories to tell. We're going to take it in turns to report from the world of education as we've seen it, and reflect on some of the episodes. I mean, recent episodes, if you want to just check in recent ones, I think the one with Renee Kneiper and Valentina David from Toots Revoluzi was fantastic. So I'm a massive fan of formative action and that whole concept. And I'm going to be working on writing something with those two along the lines of how formative action, which is really designed as a formative process that teachers use, is actually almost like a framework for coaching another teacher for professional dialogue. So that's interesting. So I love the way all these things connect. And the one before that, where we had John Hutchinson talking about his work with Reach. So recent episodes have been amazing, and it's great to carry on. We've got some super big hitters coming up in the next few weeks, which is great. So look, you could go first. What's something which you've been thinking about, or that you've engaged with recently, where you think this has been really interesting?
I'm really interested at the moment in something that keeps coming up everywhere I go, which is kind of linked to curriculum, but is almost like a next stage. So I'm working with lots of schools up and down the country who've spent a long time, really careful thought and really kind of rich discussion and research into how to create these beautiful curriculums. And they're all beautifully sequenced, and they've got all of these kind of well thought through aspects to them in terms of the documentation. And then what's a lot of schools that I'm working with are finding is that the task design bit is the next part of kind of the curriculum design process, where lots of schools are finding that they're hitting a bit of a stumbling block, as in the curriculum is beautifully sequenced and designed, but somehow isn't landing. And so we're doing lots of work around actually what's the diet of a day like for a child in school? What types of things are they actually being asked to do? And I was talking to a colleague earlier today, and he said, we've got this gorgeous curriculum. You read it and it sings. He said, and then I walk around the school and it's a teacher with a PowerPoint talking about the PowerPoint, the children writing about what they've just talked about on the PowerPoint, and that's the same for every year group, for every lesson, for every subject. And he said, and that's not what we intended. So a lot of the schools that I'm working with are thinking about, okay, well, how can we bring this really gorgeous curriculum to life in terms of the experiences that the children are having through really carefully designed tasks that aren't necessarily generic in their structure, but are still rooted in how we learn and what might be useful. So that's a really fascinating discussion that I'm having with lots of schools about how do you bring the curriculum to life in the way that you design the things that you want the children to do.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. It's one of the things that, going back a few years when people were sort of really getting into this whole curriculum review wave, which was, 2018 sort of time. And I always felt that there are a number of sort of passes through that you need to do. One of them is the sequencing of the concepts within a subject, which is it is the most important thing to do. But then there's the kind of linking between subjects, which doesn't really work unless you've linked them separately first, I don't think. But then on top of that, it's like, it's looking for themes of experience, which it's kind of rubbish if you, for example, do, we come on to talk about Oracy a little bit later, but let's say Oracy is important. So everyone's doing Oracy, or you want students to sort of, I don't know, present something to a class as a thing. Oh, let's all do presentations. It's like, what you want to do is think of the types of learning experience which you want to say every child at our school gets. And then you have to do a bit of a kind of mapping of those without it being too onerous, but to sort of say, this unit is the unit where we have this pedagogical approach which comes alive in this way, and this one will use this approach, but so that they have a bit of a flavor to them, like a piece of an extended writing outcome, or an oral presentation outcome, or whatever. Is that type of thing? I mean, is that what you'd be expecting schools to do?
Exactly. And I think a lot of schools have been very thoughtful in terms of lesson structure, lesson design, but it's almost become informed to the point of becoming overly formulaic, rather than it being principles that are guiding you in your lesson design. It's become so prescriptive that the children are just bouncing from same lesson to same lesson to same lesson. And quite rightly, this head teacher that was talking to you today said, when I did my pupil interviews across the school, so the children just telling me every lesson feels the same, every lesson sounds the same, every lesson we're doing the same activities. And he said they didn't want to say, he said they didn't use the word bored. He said, but that's pretty much what was coming out. You know, we know that every lesson is going to look like this, whether we're doing RE or whether we're doing history or whether we're doing geography. And he was actually saying, well, how do we bring back a little bit of colour and flavour and richness to the experiences that the children are having? And so I'm going to be working with him and his staff over the coming months on that, because he loves his curriculum, but he doesn't love how his curriculum's working in the
this is where you know, and sometimes this comes back to me like it was a sort of like some official body designed this, but rather than it being a random thought I had one day, which is mode A, mode B teaching. That's always stood me in good stead in terms of the thinking. So you've got to think about, what do I want my children to know? And including that knowledge means things they should know through experience. So for example, that includes things like so for example, does everyone get to grow a plant as part of their biology education? Does everyone get to burn something, or melt something, or like to do it themselves? Because if the teacher does it, it's very different from if every child gets to do it. And you think, well, is that up to the teacher to decide that because they feel like it or because they fancy it? Or is that something we say, no, in our school, everyone gets to grow a bean, or and so it becomes part of the curriculum that the experience is the knowledge. So there's that. But then there's also the mode B, which is the forms of kind of learning. So things like, can I get the children to read about this and then share what they read? Because if we're teaching kids to read, they should be able to read for meaning. And then we can say, in this unit, it's quite sort of text read. So we're not going to present it, we're going to read it. And then they might read independently and then share what they read. And you can set up learning, which is, the knowledge is still important, it's still sequenced. And I think that needs thinking. But it's a lot, isn't it? So again, this is where we get the chat about prepared, centralized schemes of work. If you've got a team of people who prepare stuff and they've thought all about it, that can be useful, provided the teachers know why and have some parameters of choice. It's interesting. I saw, when you talk about task design, I even saw some lessons recently where they're in maths, for example, where they're using concrete resources, and it's almost like they thought we should be using these, beads and Cuisenaire rods because we're supposed to, but actually they didn't need them. So the children were sort of playing around with these beads and thinking, what am I supposed to do with them? And when I said, well, what's the answer? They just could do it anyway. So they couldn't really work out what the beads were for to help them work out the answer. And it was that, I used to think teaching's hard, you know, because everyone's trying to integrate all these ideas. And sometimes the vehicle for the idea gets in the way of the actual just raw goal of what am I trying to do. So
Yeah, it came about as well, the task design conversation, because I was in a school and we were having a look at some of the children's books and some of the children's work as part of some work we're doing, and they were all laid out on the table, on this very big table, and I hadn't got my glasses with me. They're in my bag. And I couldn't see, but I thought, are these books all the same subject? Because all of the task designs and all of the layouts were exactly the same. There's only when I went and got my glasses and had a look, I was like, oh no, that's RE, that's geography. But the task designs were so generic. And I was thinking, these children are doing potentially 4 of these a day that are exactly the same, which made me think, yes, they may be an efficient way to do something, but there's that consideration of kind of user experience at the end about, is this way actually going to make children want to engage with this subject and really want to do more of it, if they're thinking, oh god, here we go, another one of these for me to do. So it's thinking really carefully about what's the best task that gets them to think, either to acquire the knowledge in the first place, you know, does doing this actually help this to stick? And then once they have that knowledge to think with, is what I'm asking them to do the most efficient way to get them to apply that? What will it tell me as a teacher about what they know and where their misconceptions are? And then what am I going to do with it? And are we proud of the outcomes that they produce? Do they feel that they're purposeful, these tasks that they're doing? Or is it, as the phrase that I keep using, Hansel and Gretel in your curriculum, where you feel like you've got to prove we were all in the same room at the same time doing something, so we must drop a little piece of written evidence somewhere just to say that we were all here and we did something? So it's kind of moving away from the Hansel and Greteling of your curriculum to actually, is this a useful thing to do? Is it helpful, and is it the right thing for these children to be doing?
Well, I think sometimes you need to, like, someone needs to sort of do that. This is why you need to go through things in like circuits that we've got some, there it is. And now let's look at it again. What's it like to be the year 2 child experiencing that curriculum?
Yeah.
And then make adjustments. And so one of the things I feel like with a kind of mode B lens on is mapping across a week or a term, say, certainly, what sorts of things that a child might do, and then see if there's any changes you need to make. So you don't sort of, sometimes organically there's a nice range, and so you think, well, don't mess about with it, it happened organically, that's great.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to think, no, there's not enough of that, or we've put all the sexy stuff in year 7 and the year 8s is a very boring, you know, all the sort of field trips or the practical stuff, the field study.
Yeah.
Why have we put it all in the first term of year 7 to get engaged them? It's like year 8 can be a bit, because the groovy stuff isn't there. But also, I think it's also about looking at endpoints is a quite useful mechanism for that. So there's things like the International Primary Curriculum does it, and some schools, like, I think if you look at, say, Simon Smith, who's, you know, we've mentioned him before about he's so brilliant on children's books, but he's also, his school, if you look at their curriculum website, you know, it says the sort of question they're asking and the endpoint thing will be we're going to make something, or we're going to present something, or we're going to write something, and you kind of know this curriculum area is heading towards this sort of outcome, and and then of course they've mapped out different flavors of that, and I think that's really sensible.
There's the manageability aspect of it as well, because I've been in year groups where the curriculum's beautiful, but poor Claire, who's teaching that year group, in one half term has got to bake a loaf of bread, make a volcano, make a model of the water cycle, and she's literally got no spare space left in her classroom for the children left, because it's full of miniature orreries everywhere. So it's also looking at the overall manageability of the task design and the curriculum for the teacher as well, because the flip side of that is that you make everything like super duper mega interesting, you've got all these wonderful fantastic endpoints, but actually you've got nowhere to put it, and the poor teachers absolutely run ragged trying to do all of these amazing things as well. So I think there's a sweet spot between the what you're actually asking children to do, does it do what it needs to do for them, what's the user experience like, and is it manageable for the staff in the school as well? So that's where my thinking's sitting at the moment, all about bringing the curriculum to life in a manageable and interesting way.
Yeah, that's great. And then I'd weave into that things like opportunities for children to make occasional choices, so that they're scaffolded choices, they're directed choices, and they're sort of meaningful choices. But there's a sort of optionality to sort of how you represent your knowledge, or which specific case study you picked, or which poem you wanted to choose to describe, or which weird animal you wanted to focus on for their crazy adaptations, and those sorts of things. You don't, not everything needs to be standardized, provided the children have got the tools to kind of engage with that particular example. Okay, so I actually think, I mean, we've got an episode coming up where we're going to focus on Oracy with some expert Oracy folk. Won't say exactly who yet, but
no spoilers.
well, I don't want to get them too sort of on the spot, but I think that is an example. So it's coming up at the moment. So this is my choice for the thing, which has been interesting to me that it's coming up, because the reason why people are talking about it, or have been recently, is because people have a natural fear, and a well-grounded one, in government initiatives in education, which are going to end up as being mandates. So, it's been trailed that the Labour Party, should they win the next election, which seems likely, are going to be promoting Oracy. And then there's a commission being set up with Jeff Barton, who has previously just finished being the most amazing General Secretary of ASCL, the head teachers union, and is now going to be on a commission to kind of look at Oracy, because he's always been a promoter of Oracy. So now people are going, whoa, what's this Oracy? What even is it? And they're fearful of some sort of like initiatives which say every school has to do this, and it becoming kind of tick boxy and so on. So it's interesting, isn't it? That's our reaction, or not our, it's some people's reaction to this thing. When on the other side of that, to me, I just think, oh my gosh, do we need more children speaking with more confidence day to day to day? Oh, of course. Now, you just go into so many lessons where, children are pretty quiet and don't speak very much and can't speak for any length of time about something. And teachers sometimes are under so much sort of pressure to cover, and they do that classic thing of sampling the room without involving every single child. Or, as I wrote about quite recently, the quality of the talk they have set up is sort of thin. It's sort of going through the motions, and you think, so we do need to do more work on it, and I'm excited about it, and I can't wait to sort of talk to our guests about Oracy. But the reason I mention it now is because it's a classic example where, you call it what you like, you call it rhetoric or speaking or student talk, if you prefer, but when there's a sort of initiative which has the potential to make a big impact, it's exciting. But at the same time, there are all sorts of like fear factors there, which I think, wow, don't mess it up. Let's not make a mess of this opportunity. So what's your take on that?
I think working in primary predominantly, language is so front and center all of the time. And primary classrooms are very often, I don't want to say noisier, with noisier being a detrimental thing or a criticism, but they are deliberately more full of talk than potentially a secondary environment, because you're constantly trying to get children to speak, to use language, to develop their confidence, to develop their ability to interact with other people, to use the language of the curriculum that you're trying to teach. So there's inherently a lot more talk-based activity in primary, also because a lot of them are yet to secure the skills of writing. So the only way a lot of the time you can find out if they do know something is to talk to them, and so you want to elicit that information through talk. I do think it's one of those things that can get skewed and squished out of shape, though, in the wrong hands potentially, if it does become kind of an identikit way of, do your do now, and now do 5 minutes of Oracy, and I'll use a stopwatch to make sure that you've done enough, and it becomes tokenistic rather than actually fundamental and underpinning, then that's where it has the potential to go wrong. If it becomes a stick to beat people with because they have or haven't done it, either they've done it in the wrong way, or they've not done it enough, or done it too much, then that's not what its aim is. And I think that it's got the potential to be absolutely beautiful if it's used across the board and done well and done skillfully and done thoughtfully. I think if you try and McDonald's it and try and make it, you know, every lesson served up in exactly the same way, that's not what it is. So
Yeah,
I
if it
understand.
becomes a thing where, you know, when the inspector calls you, what you have to do is show them your Oracy kind of audit kind of thing, you know, and that's the thing. But at the same time, I always find interesting when you say in primary, whereas in secondary, because I work across both all the time in the same, sometimes back-to-back days. And I actually think that the challenges with like really good talk are exactly the same. You know, so the last 2 days I've been in schools, primary schools, all day, and the conversations we're having about, say, think, pair, share, are identical to the ones you're having in a secondary school. It's about, what did you want them to be able to say? Did they say it? Could they say it? How do you know if they were saying things which were meaningful and helping them learn? And, you know, do they have the routines of taking turns to share? And one of the things that is kind of harder in primary is kind of avoiding the kids just sort of talking simultaneously, or one person doing all the talking, or them sort of just sort of going, it was nice, you know, and so I feel that's exactly the same as if you're in a sort of year 11 class talking about the quality of talk there. So I just think the nature of organizing people in a room to have structured talk that's really rich and language developing is a common thing. And it's one of the things I find is a great unifier, in fact, between primary and secondary. There are a few lessons where it's like, it's totally legitimate to have heads down maths practice lesson or whatever, you know, no talking, just get on with it, kind of perfectly legitimate, sensible, in fact. So you've got to have this sort of diet of when talking helps and when it's not. But let's park that one, because we're going to have a whole episode on Oracy.
Save your best comments, Tom.
Yeah, and what we'll do is we'll hear from the people who know more about it than I do first. Okay, so what's your next thing that you've been thinking about?
Oh, we've been talking, which kind of ties into this idea of task design a little bit, lesson design a little bit. Been reading a lot of things about developing expert or becoming expert, and about how expertise develops. And anybody who talks to me at the moment, I'm wafting this book at them, which is, it's called Expert: Understanding the Path to Mastery by Roger Kneebone. I recommended it to Ollie. He's reading it, and so's Hailey Hughes. She's reading that, and Sam Strickland's reading it at the minute. So it's actually addictive, and although it's not written from a teacher perspective, it's written predominantly from a medical perspective. It's a really useful overview of the specific stages that you go through as a practitioner to becoming a master of your craft. And the more I read it, the more I think there are parallels with the development of expert teaching as well. And I'm on the part about how experts move away from alignment and become experts in improvisation, which made me start to think about centralized planning. And I was thinking, how does the centralized planning approach work with a truly expert teacher? And it was just lots of provocations for me to start thinking about what the lived experience of novice and expert practitioners are in school.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And you have to get the sequencing right. This is one of the problems where you sort of standardize everybody. It's like a process, isn't it? And I mean, this is a kind of recognized thing, isn't it? That expertise allows you to deviate, but mainly because and I make this case all the time with, say, teaching techniques, or like, improvisation in music starts with kind of knowing some stuff which is fairly straightforward, and then you vary it. You can't vary something that's, you don't start with a variation. You start with a standard and then you vary it. And I think that's really interesting. my take on the expertise that I've seen recently in this thing is a thing around the culture that you have in a school where expertise seems to be flourishing, is where the teachers are even more open to discussion and critique and being observed and thrashing out details of basic stuff. And this is one of the things I feel is a bit of a paradox. You would imagine that, like with our, say, our walkthroughs toolkit, there's like hundreds of techniques. You'd imagine that the more expert teachers would be sort of doing more niche things. But I find that in schools where you find there's real kind of expertise, the expert teachers seem to be much more interested in the detail of the standard things, like running a classroom so that every single child can share their idea. And how do I know what that idea was? And this is kind of a regular thing you do every day. It's not like some fabulously a sophisticated teaching pedagogy. It's just the functional thing of the day-to-day experience of that child over there, right in the far corner from me, and how do I interact with them, and how do I check in with them so that their meaning is coming across to me, and theirs and theirs and theirs. And it's the details of that. And I visited a school recently, which I mentioned them before on a previous podcast, but that was St Michael's in Holborn, which I mentioned them before. They were pleased to hear their name being mentioned, or mentioned one of my blog posts about the culture of the school, where you've got like great leadership of teaching and learning. And they just have these great sort of nerdy conversations about this stuff, about, well, which questions are good questions then? You know, if we're going to get them talking, what makes a good question? And do they have the tools to facilitate a conversation rather than just hoping they'll know stuff and share? And to me, that's where expertise is so interesting, because you're thinking, it's the opposite to some other places I've come across where the leaders say, yeah, but our teachers are quite experienced. We don't really want them to, they might think that's a bit basic. And they're so worried about expert teachers thinking this is all a bit beneath them, you know. And I just think, no, it's not beneath anyone. Go deeper. Don't do extra stuff. Go deeper into the course. It's where the source is, you know, it's where the interest is. Does that make sense?
There's a brilliant section in this book about expertise. Yeah, it does, because I was just thinking about the section, one of the sections I'm reading is on your path to becoming an expert. When you're an early expert, the message in the book says it's not about you. Now that's the title of it. It's not about you. It's about doing the craft really well and learning from the craft, and saying, okay, well, you might be able to do it in this circumstance, but how about this one, or this one, or this one, or this one? Because you might be doing the same thing, but in multiple different places, in multiple different ways. And so you kind of, it's not about, oh, well, I can do it. It's not about you. It's actually saying, well, what about if we change this parameter, or this happens, or what's going to happen then? What should we do? And that's the kind of nerdy geekery thing you're talking about, as in, how do you make that simple thing better? Because they're talking about reattaching bits of bowel, and in one person it's really straightforward because they're a young, healthy 21-year-old, and in somebody else it's, you know, a 70-year-old who's had multiple things happen. They're saying it's the same procedure, but it's not about you. It's actually about what's happening in front of you and how you respond to it. So I'm absolutely fascinated at the moment about the journey to becoming an expert and the mind shifts that you make as you move through early expertise to deep expertise. So that's my recommended read for now, for anybody who wants to kind of fall down a rabbit hole that they find very difficult to get out of.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, one of the sort of more kind of, it's really hard to tell this to a new teacher, that it's so hard to sort of communicate this sort of knowledge to a teacher that's at the beginning, is the relative weight that you place on specific things that the children need to know. And sometimes they say like, oh, well, how would I have known that? We say, well, you kind of, it's like, that mattered, but that was less important. Like that's okay. Doesn't matter if they got that. They'll get that eventually. That mattered. And how would I know? Well, I know because over time you realize that like things just are much harder to grasp later if you didn't get them at the beginning, or that there's too many things there, that there's time later. People panic, there's not enough time later. There will be time. You just have to sort of trust that bit and all of that anyway. So I think I'm going to read that book then. I'm going to take your recommendation. Repeat its name for listeners. What is it called again?
It's called Expert, Understanding the Path to Mastery by Roger Kneebone, which is a great name. Dr. Kneebone, great name, nominative determinism at its finest. But I've read it and I'm on my second read through, and it is utterly fascinating. But I'm slightly fascinated by anything medical, so it plays to both of my loves there, developing expertise and the medical things as well.
No, well, I think that's fantastic, and I think I'm trying to decide whether to go to this one next or come to it in a minute. But I think I'm going to come to it in a minute because it's going to be later. But the Josh Goodridge book about instructional coaching, responsive coaching, I think is probably my favorite book that I've come across recently. Like all my books that I really rave about, they end up disappearing from my house, and now I'm thinking, where is it? But
mine's on my kitchen table. I can go and get mine, but mine's on my kitchen table because I'm part way through it.
But I feel like there are books you read when you think this is going to sort of affect the way I think about something, like almost permanently now. And this is, I think Josh's book has done that for me. So what he does, he has this framing of responsive coaching, where you deal with this 5-step framework, which you repeats all the way through the book. And it's such a useful way of thinking about the ideas. So the first one is to do with, well, essentially developing situation assessment. So when you're a teacher, you're thinking about how well do I see what's going on around me? And it's, to me, this is so interesting. And because most of my work with the teachers, where we're talking about this, or leaders of teachers, and we're saying, what do you see? What do I see? Like we can't talk about improving this unless we kind of agree more or less what's been going on here. And I think that's, to me, just absolutely crucial that you start there. You know, what's happening? Can you detect this? And teachers different radar for perceiving things that are going on in their own rooms. And a lot of that, I mean, I feel like I've got better at that, but you can definitely feel sometimes a bit blinkered, tunnel visiony when you're teaching. How aware are you in your head of all the things that are happening? And then, of course, the next thing is insight. Being able to see solutions. So how do I solve that problem? So what do I, and helping teachers to formulate insights, that things which might solve a problem, things which might be better ideas. And then from that sort of setting goals, which is, okay, so that's a problem, so what am I going to do then? Actually planning something to actually go and do it. And then moving from that into identifying steps that are sort of doable in the day-to-day, and finally turning those into habits of things which we routinely do. I mean, this is, I was using the kind of the slight abbreviated version of that he shares in the walkthroughs book, but it's that 5-step frame and it's that starting point, those first two about getting teachers to analyze and develop insights, and then he uses that as a lens for talking about different sorts of teachers who might be expert, might be new, some teachers who are struggling to see what the problem is. Sometimes they know the problem, but they're not sure what to do about it, or their habits are so deeply embedded after 10 years of teaching a certain way. Shifting the habits, it becomes, so I just find it's made a complex domain very simple. There are lots of great people when we talk, we've spoken to Jim Knight and others about coaching, and they've all got their excellent kind of ideas. But for me, the Josh Goodridge responsive teaching framework is just totally talks to me. I think, yeah, that is it. that's I feel like it makes total sense. I don't know if you had a chance to read it yet, or
I think I've heard, I think so many people have said it's provided such clarity about not only what coaching is, but also then how to action it. So I think it's going to be a hugely helpful book for people to refer to either refine their own practice or to get started with something that they potentially felt was too big or too kind of not unwieldy, but complicated or difficult to get right. I think it's provided this really good framework to start thinking about it or to refine them in practice. And I've seen lots of tweets where people said, it's completely demystified it. I know what I'm doing now. It's completely straightforward. I feel really confident and capable to take this forward. So I think it's going to be an absolutely indispensable companion to anybody coaching.
I think one of the reasons it works is because he kind of creates his teacher characters who are slightly different in their makeup. And I just recognize all of them immediately. Like, you know, the confident teacher who kind of does this, but a teacher who's has a bit of a crisis of confidence about themselves, or someone who's new to the profession, someone who's doing it a long time. And you think the responsiveness is I'm coaching that person. I'm not just applying a sort of standard model system to, I'm finding out about them. But it's also got this, so it's got that human interactive aspect, but it's also got a technical aspect, which is allows you to just sort of do stuff which is quite routine and precise, because it's not all sort of, it's not so feel your way through. There's a kind of system you can use which helps you do it without it being too much of a palaver. And that sort of heartening, you think, oh good, I don't have to be some sort of psychotherapist here. Anyway, can I leave? I know this is probably like backing my ideas, but I just wanted to link that into, because it's connected, is what is it about where schools still are, and I don't want to pin this on any particular schools, but I've come across this like way too much. 3 lesson observations a year, and we're not allowed to do more because the union says so, or because that's the MAP policy. I just think, if you're out there and you're one of the people that is insisting that you only do 3 formal observations a year and that you can't do learning walks, or you can't get it, you're too scared to drop that in favor of sort of multiple sort of drop-ins, just what do you think you're doing? Like, why do you think that helps teachers get better or children learn more? It doesn't. It's like, it's making your school worse. Like, stop putting a roadblock in and saying we're only allowed to be observed 3 times a year. Like, it's ludicrous. Like a professional person who's having rich dialogue is talking about their practice all the time, and part of that is allowing that to be observed. You can't coach someone you never see play, so you've got to break that down. And if you're doing it from a sort of command and control thing, I just want accountability. Well, you're just one of the reasons why we don't have as many teachers as we need, you know, in the country. You're making our system one where there's like oppression and the feeling of like dancing to a tune. It's just every school I've been in where they've stopped doing the formal observation 3 times a year, where the paperwork has become more light touch, where there's regular drop-ins instead of formal observation. Every one of them says, oh my God, it's so much better. We should have done it years ago. So anyway, should I go on a bit longer about that?
I do think that there's from an observer point of view as well, I don't get very much more information after about the first 10 minutes or so of watching anybody teach anyway. And from an observer point of view, it can be a huge inefficiency in terms of use of time, because you either see too much that you're going to want to need to talk about or action, or you've seen 1 or 2 things and that remains the same 1 of the 2 things all the way through. So the kind of little short visits are potentially less stress for that person, because they know somebody's coming to look at this aspect of my practice with real focus on getting better and having the conversation and the follow-up to go around it, which can be much better than somebody literally being watched for a whole hour. Because unless you're working with somebody on developing the whole shape of a lesson, because they're at that point in their career when they need to know how to run a whole lesson, that's fine. But once you kind of knock that into shape, then it should be about those little pieces of that lesson that you're looking at. And I think that short focused drop-ins are so much more fruitful. And also, as a teacher as well, I've had lessons where I'm thinking, I wish you were in here. This is amazing. I'm a gift to teaching. This is fantastic. You should have seen this. I wish you had been in here for an hour. There's other lessons I've also taught. I'm thinking, we shall never speak of this lesson again. It's just, and you know, after the first 10 minutes that you want whoever's watching you to just leave. It doesn't normally go like this. I don't know what's happening, but you feel like you have to plow on because they're there for hours. So I think that the whole full hour is a clunky model in itself, unless you're looking at the shape of a lesson. So I think,
but some, you know, there are sometimes you go to international schools.
short the way to.
Sorry, I think I jumped in. You were still talking, but the internet told me you weren't.
Oh.
I don't think it's I don't think it's sort of generalizable, but I've been to, whether it's it could be a quite you know, a selective international school with like everything going for it, or it could be a school which is kind of backs to the wall in a tough community or whatever. It doesn't seem to be depend on where it is. It's this sense of I need to control, like I need it to be, and then when the union is saying it, it's because they're so concerned that teachers are not going to be treated fairly. So you think, well, those two things need to have a word with each other and say both sides of that need to sort of change so that teachers aren't just judged, they're just supported, and we have professional cultures around that. And then it's an absolute no-brainer that formal observation doesn't actually make anyone better. You don't have any coaching cycle. There's no gradual improvement. There's nothing good about 3 formal observations a year. There's nothing positive about them. So there's only negatives. It's just you have to have the courage to delete that and move away from it. But some of the conversations I've had recently with certain people, they've been thinking, they sort of say, yeah, I totally agree with everything you're saying, but you're thinking, why is there a but? Like, just do it. Anyway, so that was, I had what let's have another one from you. Give me one more thing that you have been encountering on your travels.
Well, we've kind of done the Oracy and the expert and novice and the task design and the triumvirate of curriculum. So what I'm really interested in, Tom, is your trip to America and your learning from our colleagues across the pond.
Yeah, I was so interesting there. I mean, I've been to 2 events back to back, so I was pretty excited. The one was the research ed, which was in Greenwich, which is in Connecticut, just outside New York, and it was great. There's kind of a Brit posse out there. So Carl Bennett, well, he's Irish, so I shouldn't say Brit posse. He lives in our country. But yeah, so Carl Hendrick gave the keynote, which was really good, and Heidi Hughes was there, Tom Bennett, and some others. But it was like a sort of, there are various sort of people from our system going to the US. But it's so interesting hearing the US people talking and some of their discussions. And there is a kind of interesting place there where the kind of idea of cognitive science being a kind of foundation of understanding what we should do in schools, and a curriculum which has got knowledge at the core of it and so on, is really still challenged a lot. And in the other thing I went to, which was learning in the brain, which was in central Manhattan, where I had the brilliant experience of doing a talk which was about, a model for learning. And they include a reference to Dan Winningham, which all my talks refer to Dan Winningham. Dan Winningham was at my talk, so he came sitting there. I said to him before that I've got your photo on a slide and everything. Are you going to mind? He said, "Oh no, it's fine." And at the end of it, I said, "I hope I didn't like trash your reputation there or something." He said it was fine. But also some of the discussion that was it's interesting because there's it's a conference where a lot of the speakers are scientists, neuroscientists, but a lot of their emphasis was about things like empathy and individual differences and neurodiversity, and the kind of stuff where when you're teaching a class of children, you need to be aware of the we want to empower them all, that type of language. And it's interesting to me, the emphasis placed on that, even to where I was on a panel where someone was saying, it doesn't really matter what the content is. First of all, you have to work out whether kids want to sort of debate in a competitive way or a collaborative way, or what colors they respond well to. And I was thinking, whoa, this to me is like not the territory which you would find at a research ed conference in the UK, where we're talking about sequencing curriculum, making sense of things in conceptual terms, in terms of a body of knowledge. And of course, we teach in a human interactive way, but it's not really possible to attend to every child's specific things as if they're absolutely critical in the moment. So to me, there was like, whoa, it's like coming at this beast of teaching from quite different angles. Even if we would find loads of common ground, the way we express the ideas can be quite different. And I know there's an interesting sort of debate / battleground in the US at the moment, which is quite hot around maths education, even around reading and phonics, which is playing all this out. So, I mean, it's a lot to go into there, but I find it so interesting how those debates I feel we have in the UK, but I feel like we're rerunning some of the discussions that were quite strong about 10 years ago. People are, I think, wrongly, well, definitely wrongly attach sort of political labels to these types of positions, and I think that's kind of ridiculous. But there are people who think empowerment comes through teaching my children to really know stuff properly so that they can have opinions which are well formed, rather than thinking, hey guys, what's your debating style? You know, sort of, it doesn't matter what the content is. I need to know your debating preference. I just think that doesn't seem like a good thing to me. But anyway, so these are some of the things which are happening there. Dan Willingham's talk about the impact of sort of technology on kids' capacity for reading was fascinating. And Dylan William was there, and he talked about AI and gave quite a good sort of balanced sort of account of the real benefits and possibilities of AI, and some stuff which is just where it's gone a bit of a dud. So that, again, really, really good to see those two big hits at that event. Yeah, well, so there we go.
Was it like, I was having Dan at your talk a bit like when on X Factor they sing with Beyonce, when they sing with their hero. Was that your moment?
Yeah, it was just, you know, the best thing that's ever happened to me, you know. I was genuinely sort of excited about that because, you know, I think ultimately Dan Willingham is just a person who's written some really cool stuff about learning, but he's been massively influential. I just think his clarity of thinking is exceptional. And I literally mention why don't students like school in every introductory talk I ever do about being evidence informed, because to me, it's what evidence informed means. It means having an idea of learning and a model for it, which is informed by studies, but then you can use and apply in multiple situations. And I think his model and the way he explains it is so clear and so and sustained through various kind of additional things that you might include to it, add to it, but it's the fundamentals of it are so useful. And yeah, so I feel like he is one of a small handful of people who have shaped my entire thinking about teaching. So yeah, for him to meet him and for him to come to my talk, was like, yeah, whoa, I was quite happy about that. Well, look, I mean, so it's amazing, isn't it?
That's amazing.
There's so many things that go on, and to round it up, I've still got other things on my list that I was going to talk about, but we could come to those another time.
Got to watch learning walkthroughs, surely.
Learning walkthroughs.
Not least because it's actually my daughter revised properly.
Yeah, I mean, we're quite excited about this idea. We still feel it's an idea which is perhaps not quite sort of found its audience yet. So, because it's funny, you're writing a book which is aimed at students, but the people who are aware of it are teachers. And when the teachers read it, they're thinking, well, this is for the students, it's not for me. And we need to sort of, well, I think once students, in the trials we've done when students have got hold of it, they find it really useful. So basically, it's explaining all the stuff about learning and what happens at school and reading and writing to them. And it's a kind of an experiment to see whether a book about learning is something which young people kind of need or find interesting. And so, yeah, so if you're interested in sharing some of that with your students in your school, let me know, because it'd be good to see what they think of it. Okay, well, look, thank you so much. It's great to talking to you, Emma. So many ideas, and hopefully some of that resonates with some of your experience out in the field, people. We've got some great guests coming up. Later this summer, we're talking to David Didow, we're talking to Christine Council, amongst others, and we're very excited about that. So see you all very soon. Thank you so much for listening to Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe, and we'll see you all really soon.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner and I've been presenting with my co-host Tom Sherrington. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share on social media and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel, search for Mind the Gap with Tom and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer for today's episode was Luke Kemper.